Hi.
Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is another edition of EntheoRadio. This is your host, Trevahr Ryan Hughes. I'm being joined by Rick Doblin, PhD. Say hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
And I've got Xana Moonflower, our switchboard operator, on the line too.
Hello.
Once again, our show is... Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, I'm looking forward to the exchange tonight. It's going to be great.
All right. Thanks, Rick. Our show is live for our listeners out there in Internet Radio land. I want to remind everyone of our phone number and our call-in policy. You're welcome to call in with questions for myself, Rick, our special guest, and Xana Moonflower. We ask that you hold your calls till about 8:30 Pacific time, so about 30 minutes into the show, whatever time zone you're call or you're listening in from. Now, our line that you can reach us at is 855-8334. Once again, that's 347-855-8334. And just follow the instructions on Blog Talk Radio there, and they'll probably ask you to speak or to press 1 to speak with the host. That's us. Let me introduce Rick a little bit more now that we're up and running. Rick Doblin is the founder and the executive director of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Sciences, which was founded in 1986. Is that right, Rick?
Yeah, that was right. MDMA was made illegal in 85 and founded MAPS in 86.
Very good. And you founded MAPS as a result of the illegality of MDMA, right?
Well, that and other psychedelics and marijuana, but MDMA was the battle that took place when I was really starting to understand what was going on and being able to help out, and where we sued DEA to try to protect the therapeutic use of MDMA. And we won in several different courts, and eventually we lost. And it was pretty clear that the only way to get therapeutic use back of MDMA in particular, but then also other psychedelics, because it's really psychedelic medicine as a whole, including marijuana, that we'd have to go through the FDA and that nobody else was going to do it. Not the pharmaceutical industry, not the government, not the big foundations. It would be the people that believed in it, that knew it worked, or that felt it worked. And so I started as a nonprofit medical marijuana and psychedelic pharmaceutical company. And that's basically what we are, and we're starting to get more and more credible all the time.
And you're also membership-based at maps.org, right?
Yeah, we have about 2,300 members. We'd like to double or so. We're at this stage where basically it's been 25 years to try to, for the first time, prove that even in a small pilot study with a lot of concerns about it's not complete proof, it's just a small probe, an initial study, that now we can say that there is some reason to go further. And it seems as if the culture has reached that place too. So it's not a struggle the way it was 40 years ago. And so we're working together with veterans. There still is some official resistance at the VA and at the Department of Defense, but there's also strong interest. And the more that we go, the more that we are building these lines of connection and healing. And I think the problems of our culture are so great, going forward the next 30, 50, 100 years, the next bunch of generations, that we kind of need to work together, the different parts of our society. Diversity is our strength, and there's going to be a similar thing about consciousness, that we need all of our faculties and all the states of consciousness, and that there's got to be a way for our society to integrate these and also acknowledge the risks and try to understand the risks and try to reduce the risks and do harm reduction, but in a more human rights context. So that's where, even though my main interest is in becoming a licensed legal psychedelic therapist, I've also tried to understand the cultural dynamics, and that's where I went to get my master's and PhD at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government in public policy and how the medical use of Schedule I drugs is regulated. So now we're at the point where on Monday, it really was the culmination of this whole arc since 1985, since it was criminalized, and since people in the middle 70s really started using MDMA as an underground therapeutic drug. And underground not because it was illegal, but just because there was such a cultural reaction against psychedelics that even though it wasn't technically illegal, the less people knew about it, the more it could be explored.
Very good. And so some articles got published on Monday. Can you direct us and our listeners to those articles if we wanted to look them up?
Yeah. The way to do it is to go to the Journal of Psychopharmacology website. And if you look at the latest articles, what we've done is we've paid a special fee. We've paid $3,000 so that the articles, most articles in scientific journals, are unfortunately copyrighted, and you have to pay a fee. It's actually, in this journal, it was $32 for one person to look at it. So we paid $3,000, and so it's completely free. And I'll get you the URL in a minute.
All right.
And while I'm looking for that, though, we have another version on the MAPS website. So you could just come to maps.org, and right on the home page, we have the same version.
Okay,
so
great.
That might be easier for people to get to. But the Journal of Psychopharmacology did a terrific job reviewing the paper, looking at all the arguments back and forth. And this is the first scientific study, controlled study, of the therapeutic use of MDMA ever in the scientific literature. And I say that in light of the fact that we tried before. I mean, there has been so much resistance. We had a study that we worked on with Jose Carlos Busso in Spain, was working on for his PhD. It was the first study in the world with MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, and we started it in 2000. We finally got permission, and he started enrolling subjects and started working. It was dose response, starting low dose and moving up. And in 2002, there was some really positive media attention in the largest newspaper in Madrid, the main TV station. But that alerted the Madrid Anti-Drug Authority, and they clamped down, and they got the study stopped, even though there was no scientific reason to stop it. So this has been, ever since it was criminalized in 85, it was clear that there was some potential here that should be explored for therapeutic potential, and that it was, all of it was rejected for the first 5 years, from 85 to 90. Actually, it took FDA 7 years to finally approve the first study with MDMA, and then it's taken, after that, another 12 years for us to get all the permissions. Actually, it took us only 9 years to get permission for the MDMA study for post-traumatic stress disorder from FDA, but then getting institutional review board and DEA approval, that took us 3 more years. This has been about $1.5 million, about 24 years, basically. And we just struck gold. Basically, what we had was a phenomenal male-female co-therapist team. And they had all the qualifications that this is not MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for nothing. It's not MDMA. It's the combination with therapy. And so we have, on our website, described what the method is. It's called a treatment manual. And we're even now at the next stage of research of trying to have people who are trained in what our method is watch videotapes of therapists actually administering MDMA to patients and then rating them on different dimensions. So we're trying to piece apart what is it about the therapist team and this therapist interaction with the patients that's so healing. Because the results here are outstanding. People that were, on average, 20 people, on average 19 years, more than 19 years with PTSD, and had failed on the available medicines and had failed on psychotherapy, both. These are chronic treatment-resistant
post-traumatic stress disorder patients. Of this 20, 3 of them were on disability and couldn't work. And at the end of the study, what turned out is that over 80% of the ones that had MDMA at the end of the study, they no longer had post-traumatic stress disorder. And after the therapy, only 25% of the placebo people did. So that and over time, not even much time, one of those 2 people with the placebo response, it faded very quickly within a few months after we assessed them at 2 months after the last treatment. And we negotiated with FDA during the course of the study that we could give all the people who had the placebo could enroll in the study again, but get MDMA for sure. And 7 of the 8 of those people decided to do that. And all of them did really well going through it again. So we really do have, of these 20 people, even though it was 12 people went through MDMA compared to 8 placebo to show this difference, then with all the placebo people going in, the percentage of healing is much higher. It's astonishing. So that there is something seriously going on here, but we don't really quite understand what it is. And we know that there's cultural differences, there's different kind of patients, there's therapist differences, there's people it doesn't work in. We don't understand exactly who the responders are and who the non-responders are, but this now is like it's like the flag in the ground. It's the first goal in the game. This is the foundation stone. This is the paper about the therapeutic use of MDMA. When you go into Medline and you do a search, this is the online database of peer-reviewed medical journals going back to 1965, just enormous, millions of articles, and this is like the world scientific literature. You put in that's medical scientific, and you put in the words ecstasy or MDMA, and you get over 3,500 papers on MDMA. Governments around the world trying to see what's wrong with MDMA have spent $300 million or more on all of this research. It's an enormous body of research, and this is the first paper from a controlled study of the therapeutic use of the beneficial use of MDMA for any purpose whatsoever. And it's taken us all this time to get that, but it's enough that it is so promising and shows that there is something there that, at least as far as we can tell, there's no evidence of harm that the people who participated in the study have suffered. Not to say that some people won't or that it's not perfectly safe, but that as far as we can tell, we can't see it. And we've done sophisticated neurocognitive studies after 2 doses of MDMA. We've looked at people's heart rates, at their temperatures, at their all sorts of things about their psychological health. So what we need to do basically is to move towards, this is the first successful pilot study called Phase 2. And the main criticism of this study is that the double-blind didn't work, meaning that the placebo was an inactive placebo, and the people who were in that group and the therapists could tell if the people got MDMA or the people got a placebo.
Right.
That's the criticism, and that's a valid criticism. The fact that people were stuck with PTSD for over 19 years, failed on other treatments, it's hard to say that it's just because they believed it would get better, because they may have been in other circumstances where they thought that it might work. But maybe. So what we're saying is that the next study, we are moving towards trying to figure out what is the scientific design, the methodological design of the large-scale study that would have hundreds of people in it. We need 2 studies, each of them with around 300 people in them. And those are called the Phase 3 studies. But we don't even know yet how to design those. And what we're toying with, or what we're experimenting with in our next study, which is a different kind of a design. It's going to be a low dose of MDMA, a medium dose, and a full dose of MDMA. So everybody knows that they're going to get MDMA. The therapists all know that. The patients know that, but they don't know which dose they're getting. So if we can confuse people to maybe 25% of them guess wrong as to which dose, including like both therapists and patients, then that's in a way a successful double-blind study that they couldn't tell. There was some degree of error They could be right even more than half the time, but if they just can't tell, then they're not. It's more of a sort of check against their bias, or they're showing what they want to show, or thinking that they're going to get this magic drug and that it's going to cure them, and then getting cured just because of the belief that there's nothing. But what we needed is a baseline of side effects in order to do all of this drug research. And so we're probably 3 years or so away from what's called an end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, where you bring together all of your studies. And we're doing an international series of studies. In Switzerland, we finished our study, although we're working on the 1-year long-term follow-up. In the U.S., we're working on our long-term follow-up, but it's about at 3.5 years. That should be done in a couple of months. And we're working on a study in Israel, trying to start studies in Jordan, and also in Canada, and perhaps in Spain as well.
Wow.
Perhaps Romania even. So all of this is small little pilot studies trying to figure out, how does it work? What is our method? How do we describe our method? How do we train therapists in the method? How do we evaluate therapists? How do we evaluate patients and make sure that the people who are doing the evaluation are doing it in a similar way all through the different countries, through the different languages, through the different cultures? And the thing that we're going to be trying to find out with our veteran study, which is coming next, is this key question, which is, does the cause of the PTSD influence the treatment, or is the treatment for PTSD in general? So that in our first study of 20 people, it was mostly women survivors of childhood sexual abuse or rape and assault. There were 2 veterans. We actually treated 21 people. One of the veterans was not offered treatment by the VA, so he wasn't technically treatment resistant, so we didn't include him in the paper. But we have 21 people that we did treat. This one fellow did great as well, the veteran. And so we had 2. So we have we have limited information on veterans, and so our next study is going to be in 16 veterans or more if we can raise more money. And then we're going to be able to say, do veterans take the same treatment and have more or less the same results, or do we need to customize for war-related trauma or not? And then once we decide that, once we learn that, then we can say, okay, our phase 3 study is in this big patient population of everybody that has PTSD, or it's just fine-tuned for veterans, or maybe just women survivors of sexual assault. One of the studies that was done, there's 2 drugs approved by the FDA for PTSD, Zoloft and Paxil, and I think it was the Zoloft trials. One of them worked only in women. It didn't work at all in men.
Wow.
So basically we're 10 years away. We have maybe 3 years or so to go to this end of phase 2 meeting, and where we present all of the data from all these international studies and then say, hey, this is more or less, this is exactly how we want to design our phase 3 study, and then we discuss that, and then we come to agreement on it, and then we need 5 years or so to do them all. And then FDA needs a couple of years to sit around and think about it and, decide what to do. So where we're at now is just, something that I wanted to bring up that happened to me today that was sobering, to say the least, and illustrates, primarily the importance of this work. And I've just discussed such big plans and, long-scale things, and I haven't really talked much about the individual, people and the therapy and how it works, or, what it means to people. And but it was brought home today. I got a call from a police officer in the middle of the day, around noon or so, and he was wanting to know if I was the Rick Doblin from MAPS, and if I had known a particular person who had called me, and he said that this person had committed suicide and had left a suicide note for me, and the police wanted to deliver it. And
wow.
We talked about it a little bit. This person was a friend of some of the police in that town, but he was a lonely guy, and he had depression and a lot of, psychological problems, and life just wasn't worth living. And what I had known him actually for about a year. I've never met him, but I've known him for about a year through the phone, and I'd actually referred him to a therapist who was a great therapist, and he probably went to see him about 10 or 15 times. He just felt like he needed more. But, he's not a veteran. He has PTSD, he had a number of different things, and he had asked me for a referral to an underground psychedelic therapist. And I declined to provide it. I felt that he mentioned that he might have, he wasn't sure if he'd had a stroke or, he thought he had a stroke. And then I'm like, well, I don't know if he's a safe risk. And, it seemed like he tried everything. And so I didn't pass him on and said I couldn't do that. And he wrote this suicide note the very next day.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's actually really a warm and friendly note. And he says that he's writing it in part to help start to give me courage. He actually says to keep trying to bring psychedelic research to wish you courage to continue in your efforts to legalize psychedelics for the obvious reasons.
Yeah. That's amazing, Rick.
Yeah. Actually, it says for therapeutic reasons. Sorry to read. Yeah. And so, I just am brought back to that individual level, and just to think about how when, MDMA was made illegal in 1985, because we, the therapeutic community, decided ahead of time, could see ahead of time that MDMA was going to be criminalized. I learned about it in '82, and it was already clear to some of the pioneers who had been working since the middle 70s that it was heading towards criminalization. And by '83, we were organizing and coming up with plans. And by '84, I'd helped start a nonprofit organization to do MDMA research when it was still legal. And we were able to actually do an underground safety study because we still couldn't really tell it to anybody because we felt that would get it more likely to be criminalized sooner.
Right.
And then the DEA tried to criminalize it, and so we were perfectly organized, and I walked into the DEA headquarters and asked to have a hearing. And they were totally shocked because the DEA had never heard about the therapeutic use. And they had to give us a hearing, and we had great lawyers. We had terrific Washington, D.C. lawyers, pro bono. And it delayed the criminalization by about 5 months. Well, actually, it would have been much longer because they put it in July. So it was delayed almost about a year. And I just kept thinking, and then during the hearing, we were doing so well with our witnesses, with the refuting the DEA's arguments, with talking about therapeutic use, with totally shocking people in the media with monks who had talked about MDMA for meditation, rabbis who talked about MDMA like the Sabbath. We just totally came out of the frame that they expected, and had really good favorable media coverage, and they got panicked, and the DEA, so they made MDMA illegal on an emergency basis. And I just thought about, how good it felt that, for almost this year time that it was legal for all these people to be introduced to it, to have experienced it. A lot of people won't do it if it's illegal. And, for example, even this fellow who just committed suicide didn't have legal access. And it might have helped him. Now, we don't know if it would help them. Maybe it wouldn't have. But, maybe it would have. And I think it's sad that we have delayed as a society for 25 years to look at something that promotes bonding, promotes love, promotes healing, promotes honesty, promotes better listening. And we've run away from it and demonized it and just tried our very hardest to make it like one dose equals permanent brain damage. And now, finally we've got something on the scales that's like, well, one dose. Well, actually, the way we do it is an initial dose and then half that same amount after about 2 hours. And it's about an 8-hour experience, and with 2 therapists. And then people have to spend the night in the therapy center. And then there's non-drug therapy the next morning. And there's been weekly, 2 or 3 weeks of therapy like 60 to 90-minute therapy sessions with the male-female co-therapist team before the first session of getting to know each other. There's also been independent raters who are not the therapists evaluating all the patients. And so they're talking about their traumas. They're stopping all other drugs that they've been taking for this. They're getting ready to enter into the study. And then it lasts a couple months. And the MDMA sessions are scheduled about 3 to 5 weeks apart, once a month, more or less. And our big question now is, what's better, 2 or 3? And what we find is that, at least according to when we take 4 days after the MDMA session, when we do the main rating scale, that's when most of the drops. Most of the people get hope. After the first MDMA session, they get hope. Their nightmares aren't so bad. There's just a major change in their symptoms, on average. Not for everybody, but the first one is like it all. You know, almost all the gains are made in the first one. The difference between MDMA and placebo. It's just this massive thing. And then the second is more mild, and the third session is also, a little bit more deeper declines. And this is quantified in the clinician-administered PTSD scales used by FDA, used by pharmaceutical industry. It's fortunate that we have this kind of very quantified measure. We just have to make sure it works in all the different cultures. And then what we are doing is just seeing if we decide to stop at 2, and our Israeli study is at 2 sessions, and don't have to do the third. You know, when we start talking about 600 people, that's like $1 million.
Wow.
So that's like $1 million question. You know, is it 2 sessions or 3? And we've had I think a really breakthrough idea that Valerie Mojeko, of MAP's deputy director, came up with, in that we're trying to make this work, maximize the very, very best that we can, because there's so many critics, there's so many potential methodological critiques. We need the strongest signal in a way that we can get. So we are trying to load it up so that it really, really works as best we can, which means a male-female co-therapist team of 2 people who are both good at therapy. But what we've come to understand is that it could work just close to just as well. We don't know that yet, and that's one of the things. If it's a student, and then that if so, it's an experienced person and a student, still male female. The dynamics could be different, and one of them should probably be a doctor, and one of them can be anything: psychologist, nurse, social worker, another doctor, and that you've got these teams that we're going to be starting to train, and that if one of them is a student. Because what we're talking about is both individual healing. So if we're in our Jordanian study, there's the opportunity to work with Iraqi refugees in Jordan. There's 500,000 of them from the Iraq War that have, a lot of them, seen horrible things, families killed. They have a lot of cases of PTSD. So we could, in our U.S. study, be working with U.S. soldiers from Iraq with PTSD, and in Jordan, we could be working with Iraqi refugees with PTSD. In Israel, we can be working with people who have PTSD from wars with Jordan and Arab countries. And in Canada, there's even a chance that we could be working with police officers with PTSD from their job. So what we're trying to say is that this is for our society. This is not some hippie counterculture kind of, fringy thing. That it is perceived that way by some, but that the motion, the historical motion over decades and decades, is towards taking it for granted. Look, how many women actually? Okay, I'm really curious. Like, how many young women in their 20s really think much about how recent women have had the vote? You get these things.
Not many.
Yeah, you just start, but in a way it's okay. You just start taking for granted these freedoms. Mm-hmm. And you just think, hey, that's just the way it should be. How could people ever not let, women vote? Nobody could be that stupid. I remember when I was like 10, and I was born in 1953, and I was just so totally influenced by Hitler and the Holocaust, and my families are Jews. But when I was 10, I was like, wow, that really took place a very long time ago. It was like all over the world back then. And now I think, God, it just took place yesterday, and there's just a few generations. And my therapist, when I go to have my own therapy, his father was a Nazi. And that's, for me, one generation down, my sanity is in his hands, and he's, pushing me in the right direction. It's tremendous, finding of this kind of common humanity. And that's where the hope comes from. And that's where I think this fellow that committed suicide, he had no more hope. And, things are just starting to move forward at a more accepted and rapid rate. But it's not even rapid. I mean, we're so at a crawl. But at least we're moving. And that's what's so tremendously exciting. And so, it's looking like this one strand, which is MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, is being joined by a whole other strand of research that's taking place of psychedelic research. So the psychedelic renaissance has these two parts, this MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, and then it has three parts. So that's one part. The other part of it is psilocybin and other drugs for people who are dying, who are anxious and depressed about dying.
Yeah,
and
like
so there's a whole
life study.
Yeah, the end-of-life studies are just another way to try to say that these are for the mainstream. These are tools for living, and our culture has matured over the last 40 years to the point where, there's hospice centers. The first hospice center was in 1974, and by 2004 there was over 3,500. But it took that span of time, 30 years, for something that now we just think everybody, community, it's like, yeah, okay, there's a nice, comfortable place. People can say, hey, I'm ready to die, take good care of me, don't hook me up to all these machines. And, it's kind of, we take that for granted. We take the places to go for doing yoga and doing meditation all over everybody's community. That there's birthing centers all over the place. There's a whole different awareness that's, not dominant, not everywhere, but is pretty much interwoven with the entire community, and so interwoven in some ways, so connected and so supported. That's what's just happening with psychedelic research. With all the media that we've got has been fantastic related to this MDMA PTSD study. And the media that's come for the end-of-life work is also, the public is really eager for this, is ready. And so there's a study that's been completed by this group called Hefter Research Institute in psilocybin for cancer patients, 12 cancer patients at UCLA. It's been accepted for publication in the most important psychiatric journal in the world. There's studies at Johns Hopkins, studies at NYU with psilocybin. We have a study that we helped start, but then we're too controversial for continued. But we're hoping to get back at Harvard with MDMA for cancer patients with anxiety. And then we're sponsoring a study with LSD in Switzerland with end-of-life, with people with end-of-life. And so this whole trying to figure out, do the different drugs make the difference? What's the contribution of each drug? How are they similar? How are they different? And, we're just so much at the early stage of that. But it's really psychedelic medicine. And it's a psychedelic medicine, includes marijuana, that as a field, we're saying our culture, our community, our healthcare costs in all different ways would be much better by being more open about it. And I would say that it's a human rights issue, and that there is been this sense, and that's where this sort of cultural symbolic politics is, that the psychedelics are inherently disruptive and destructive and dissolving and corrosive to a culture. That's how many of the promoters sort of talked about it in terms of, it takes the film off of your eyes. You see things as they really are. Other people don't see it, and you just see how fake things are, and that you're off to go, drop out and do something somewhere else. It's like this, whole kind of thing that is, it's not, it's not tune on, turn in, get to work.
Right.
Tune on, turn in, drop out. And so But for me, I did drop out. I mean, exactly. I took a bunch of LSD my first year in college. And my first semester, I didn't even make it through my first year of college. I dropped out for 10 years. For 10 years, because my acid trips were, I was convinced that, my bar mitzvah was supposed to turn me into a man.
Wow.
The next day, I was like, hey, oh my God, I'm not a man. Where's God? And I just waited. This was like a seed that's been planted. Maybe in a few days I'll notice something. And finally, a week went by, and I'm like, man, these old-time religions and rituals just didn't cut me to the quick. But when I took acid when I was 17, it did. But it was super hard to handle. And so there was this sense for me that I did need a space, a way to try to figure it out. I even was very inspired by John Lilly and the flotation tanks. And friends and I built some, and I bought one, and I lived with one in my house. I tripped in them.
Wow.
I just had, and this was like suddenly way more interesting to me than my classes.
Yeah.
So I did. I dropped out for 10 years, but I always had the sense I would come back, and so I think there's this arc of the culture that the baby boomers and I was a draft resistor ready to go to jail, and fortunately nobody noticed. But I had never registered for the draft, and so and I was able to tell this story. It's just been the other day in military.com. If you go to military.com and just put in MDMA, there's an article. There's two articles. This is the military.com is an organization of 10 million people. These are current and former soldiers and their families. And it's just an enormous organization, like AARP kind of thing, or the AAA, the military.com is a massive organization, and they've had two articles in support, great articles about MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they talked about this whole thing about me being a draft resistor, but I'm not a pacifist, and, here was this thought that if we could have this kind of experiential, mystical connection to the human family, that then you recognize that there's something deeper than your religion, deeper than your country, deeper than your gender, deeper than your race, deeper than your class, that there is this bond, that we are part of this, that you feel that. That's where psychedelics have been used for the treatment of alcoholism and drug addiction. Ibogaine is being used for, Ibogaine can also, though, physiological reset tolerance and help people get over withdrawal for opiates. But there's been this spiritual sense of connection is helpful in a number of things, including the treatment of addiction. And in the people that are dying with anxiety, there seems to be a connection. In the past, there was, with the studies in the 50s and 60s, that the depth of the mystical experience was related to the therapeutic effect. The more they had this mystical experience, the more people felt less anxious about dying, more able to focus on the time that they had left, more content in some ways, and often made up with their families and prepared for dying. And that there is this thought that there's the level of biography, the things that happen to us in our life that are often beautiful but also often traumatic, and people work. But then there's also these things just about having a life. Oh my gosh! Wonder if that's my battery. Oh no, I don't think so. I know where to plug it in.
I'm going to make a little announcement about our phone number and our call-in line for anyone who's listening.
Yeah. Could I call in, by the way, on the other line with a different phone?
Yeah, you can call right back.
Okay, I'll do that with a phone with a battery.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
We'll see you in a sec.
Okay.
All right, so listeners, you're on the EntheoRadio station with Trevahr, Xana, and Rick Doblin, Ph.D. Tonight we're talking about psychedelics and moving forward in the United States, along with a lot of studies worldwide about how to make these into prescription medications, treatments for people with PTSD, valid medicines. This is a show that's regularly dedicated to psychedelic work and to the uncovering of the great mysteries. Once again, if you're a listener and you'd like to call in with a question or a comment for myself or Rick or Xana, please dial 347, area code 347-855-8334. Rick, are you back on with us?
Yep, I am.
All right. So where would you like to pick up? Did you have something you were saying before you noticed your phone was going dead?
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is that there is this unique time that we're at right now with this opportunity to move forward, and that the kind of costs and delay through this fellow, that just lost hope, and through the beginning evidence that we have for all this work with people at the end of life, that there seems to be more of a cultural acceptance. Now, it's not to say that there's not a lot of fear still left, but that we're at this point where it feels like there is a willingness, and that of the main culture, of willingness of the sort of official world to open, to listen, to permit a little bit more evaluation. There's, this is just delicate dynamics, but that's now with medical marijuana, what I wanted to mention is, and why it's different, is that there's a monopoly on the supply of marijuana held by the federal government that you can use in research. Now, we should be laughing out loud when I talk about a monopoly on marijuana. Because
that's interesting.
Monopoly.
There is so much marijuana everywhere that for them, their monopoly is not very effective. But it's effective in one way, which is that it's the only marijuana you can use for research to make it into a medicine. And they've got it. And we have tried for 6 years to buy 10 grams of monopolized government pot to do research with vaporizers.
Wow.
Vaporizers can make it through the FDA. They don't burn. They just heat the pot up. They don't burn. And what are the arguments? Marijuana does not cause lung cancer. It has anti-tumor properties, the cannabinoids. It's being explored for treatment of cancer and a number of different things. It's awesome what it's doing. And it's just still monopolized. So that's why I'm telling stories about psilocybin, about LSD, about MDMA. We have our own independent sources of supply from DEA licensed and DEA equivalent around the world pharmacists. I never get to see it. It can only go directly to the doctors, only directly to the patients, stay in these big safes. But there is this flow, and the monopoly that is supposedly enjoyed by the government, they are so defending it. We've won a DEA administrative law judge lawsuit. We're trying to have it grown at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst by Professor Larry Craker, who's head of the medicinal plan program. It would liberate millions and millions of private dollars. It wouldn't cost the government one penny. If they wanted to solve medical marijuana controversy, under the FDA research, all they have to do is say, yes, we're going to end the government monopoly, and they would liberate millions, many, many millions, 10 million of private funds that won't cost the government a penny. Actually, it makes the government money, because once we're starting to try to, make this into a medicine and it's super serious and we have all this money, then we might have to pay fees. You pay fees to the FDA to review your new drug application. So then we start even becoming and that's what's going on with medical marijuana in other places. People are paying sales tax, but we're now at a point where it's we've won the lawsuit. The DEA has rejected the administrative law judge recommendation, but it's not been finalized. President Obama has nominated Michelle Leonhardt to be the new administrator of DEA. She's currently the acting administrator. She's a Bush holdover, has been there since 2004. She's the one that's led the charge against medical marijuana in the states of California, even when it wasn't in violation of state law. She's been responsible for blocking medical marijuana research. There's just a lot of things. But one of the things that Obama did, and Attorney General Eric Holder did when early in the administration, is they sent a message to DEA and they said, if people are not violating state law, medical marijuana patients or providers, let them alone. Do not go after them. And DEA kept going after them. Then they had to put it in the writing. Then they even had a press conference where the Attorney General brought the head of the DEA at the press conference and then said, we are not going to be doing this anymore. But they finally got the message. But Obama appointed her to be the acting director. I mean, she is not the acting director, but the permanent administrator of the DEA. And so there's efforts to try to say that she should not be nominated. She's been nominated. She should not be confirmed unless she agrees to let the medical issue of marijuana be decided by science and not ideology and politics.
Great.
And so there's various campaigns now trying to work get people. There's the Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, the Students for a Sensible Drug Policy. Other organizations are weighing in on trying to bring this word to Congress that we need to end the monopoly, the federal government monopoly on supply, and we need to only let somebody who's at the head of the DEA that will let states be laboratories of experimentation on how to regulate medical marijuana. And they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to, they meaning this sort of the still dominant, still powerful federal government that is suppressing medical marijuana research, even though they're losing public support. They've lost public support already, and they're losing public follow-through even. Their direct disobedience by multiple states, 14 states, in the District of Columbia even, is a medical marijuana place. They're starting to talk about dispensaries in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
With patients in Washington, D.C. This is so bad that the only time in American history that there was an election and the people were ordered not to count the votes, other than in this presidential election with Bush.
Yeah.
The only other time was with a medical marijuana initiative in Washington, D.C. And Congressman Bob Barr, Republican, said, because everything, the budget of the District of Columbia is completely controlled by Congress. And they said, you shall not spend a penny to count the results of this election. And that stayed for a couple of years before it got overturned. And then it turned out the election, it won like 67 or so percent in favor of medical marijuana. So that it was like suppressing of, I mean, it's just amazing what people will do to support the drug war. But I'm realizing we haven't left that much time for questions, so I'll be quiet.
Well, I have a question, Rick. We're talking about, you're talking about the placebos and how they're having a really hard time figuring out how to get the right type of therapist with the right dosages and all of those things. But it's not like they're not treating these things with drugs now. I mean, they're already treating PTSD and, depression and the guy we were talking about earlier who committed suicide, unfortunately. I mean, these people have probably already tried a whole array of drugs and, obviously without any kind of, help. So, I mean, why don't they just compare the studies of using like MDMA and LSD and psilocybin to the current drugs that they're already using and just compare the effects that way? I mean, I have someone who's close to me who like you were talking about, the other problem is the payment for these things. She has, psychological issues, and she's on her mother's insurance, and there's only a certain lifetime allotment for an amount that can be spent on that. And once she uses that up, they're like, sorry, no more therapy for you.
Wow.
So what is she supposed to do?
Okay, well, you ask a fundamental question, which is, this study where you just compare MDMA, let's say, against somebody that gets Zoloft or Paxil.
Right.
And the reason, there is a reason, and I think it does make sense, which is that, we do, as human beings, we do try to see the world the way we want it to be. And, people can fool themselves. And then we also get stuck on things that we don't want to admit we're wrong. And or it's complicated if we have to rethink it. We've made our compromises, and now we got to think, when we got so much invested in it. So for comparing something against a placebo eliminates a certain amount of bias, and that is considered to be one of the biggest advances of science in the 20th century was the double-blind placebo-controlled study.
Right.
In terms of medicine. And you can over-rely on it, and you can say, that it's not everything. And certainly things don't start there. Things start where you say, hey, man, this person has been struggling for 19 years, and now they're better. Something happened. I think this is what it was, but proving it to scientific standards, and that is, I think, the advantage, I think that we have as a society, that we are both scientifically minded, innovative, challenging, ever-evolving scientific method, and there is a certain freedom to challenge the status quo, and that we, and that there can be innovation. It's not just challenge, but it's innovation. It's not just we're proposing new ideas, but we're sort of scouts about what's up ahead and how to get there. And so it's this situation where there's got to be a way to link all the parts of our psyche, all the parts of our society together to look at these incredible challenges that we have. And I think psychedelics and multiple states of consciousness are going to be a part of coming to grips with and being inspired by and getting solutions and suggestions and the energy to keep trying. So I think that the double-blind, we have to say science is the bedrock, because religion gets cluttered with dogma. There is a saying about science that I think is worth us pondering. It's that I think it was by a quantum physicist in the 20s, but I'm not exactly sure. But it was that science precedes funeral by funeral. So that even science, we have this. We're all stuck in being humans, and that's the fundamental challenge, the fundamental problem, the fundamental limitation, or the fundamental perspective that can make it all work out right, is that if even science proceeds funeral by funeral, what hope is there? And but there is. It's like a multi-generational, maybe little bits here and there, long-term perspective. But, daily crises, and people are dying, and species are being killed, and forests are being deforested, and oceans are being polluted, and it really is this massive destruction going on. And, population, billions more people, but that's life. So I think we've got this rare opportunity, and that somehow, for me at least, I felt like I was overdeveloped intellectually and underdeveloped emotionally. And I feel our society is warped in the same way, that we have this massive technology, and we're still like murdering people because their skin's a different color, or
right.
The Sufis are getting blown up in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there are really cool Muslims, and the really cool Muslims are having trouble. Just like the really cool Jews are having trouble with the Orthodox Jews. The fundamentalists of all the religions belong together, and if they didn't, they just act. They're the same, and the mystics of the different religions are more about the commonality. And so I think that we move through the fundamentalists down to the mystics and down to the people that have these experiences, and I think that's where we find common ground. And so I think this, United Nations, United Religions, global spirituality, but it's not this one world where everybody is all one thing. It's more like, wow, we are this deep down on one level, we're one thing, but look at all the next level up, all the diversity, all the multiplicity, and how cool that is, and how, different ways. It's like, a tree, and you see this forest that has all these storms in it, and there's all these, like, twisted, gnarled trees that they somehow or other managed to make it through their early years, and then up they go. It's kind of, it's like that. And so we all have these twisted, different religions, but if you can kind of get to the sun part of them, and that's where I think, for me at least, it's been so tremendously healing to work with the military, being a draft resistor and being terrified of the military, to work with people whose fathers were Nazis, to work with women who terrified me at one point, to work in Jordan with people who were just on this total other side. My great-great-grandmother moved to Israel around the turn of the century and is buried on the Mount of Olives, which is right outside the walls of Jerusalem. And she went there because that's where, when the Messiah comes, that's where the resurrection starts, right there. Messiah comes out the gate. Now, the Muslims have tried to stop that, so there's a Muslim cemetery right in front of the gate. The gate is walled up. So Messiah apparently will not walk on graves, so, maybe the Messiah's not coming. But the Jews are still, buried on the next hill, and they're like, we're going to be first. So it's kind of like, racing to eternity is hard for me to quite comprehend. But my relatives are there, and then to see life from the Arab side, from Jordan looking back, it's just been incredibly eye-opening. And so I'm hopeful, really hopeful. But I rest my hope in the scientific method. And so that's where I think that the suffering that in a way you're saying, isn't there a faster way to do this, to get this accepted? And faster does have a higher error rate, and this is so delicate. And so our large-scale studies, though, will do that as well. So it's not so much either or, but I think what the Phase 3 studies are going to have, and this is maybe a really good point near the end, is to emphasize that the scientific methodology is the key to the strength of what we're saying and to having it be accepted. So I think it'll be 3 doses of MDMA, 3 different groups, sort of low group, medium, and high, and then there'll be what's called an open-label group with Zoloft or Paxil or some medication. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that design is that people will know, because the medications the medications are ideal for the pharmaceutical companies because you're supposed to take them once a day, twice a day, every day for months or years. Yeah. And a lot of times people stop taking them and their problems come back.
Right.
So it's like a different approach completely. To just take them a few times in the process of therapy, and that I think there's going to be a lot of learning that we're going to be making about love, bonding, healing, spirituality as we move into this next phase of psychedelic research. And it can be religious, it can be spiritual, it can be business-like, it can be the same kind of rigorous, how do we get it to the most people fastest? That's why this idea of the male-female team, one of them would be a student, one of them could be a teacher. That's about integrating it faster. The point that is going to slow it down is the creation of the psychedelic clinics. I mean, it's really slow now, but once we make it into a medicine, then our fundamental approach is that it's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and therapists need to have special training to do this work.
Definitely.
And so there's going to be special licenses. We actually have permission now to do a study where we're gathering information about the psychological effects of MDMA when administered in a therapeutic setting, and we're enrolling people who are in our training program to become therapists can receive MDMA as one part as their therapy.
Wow,
and so
that's great.
It's incredible. And so we're going to be able to be training these people, but then only people with training can administer it. So we need to figure out how to do more training, how to refine the training, refine the method. So, we've got our work cut out for us, and it's 10, 20, 30 years, who knows. But I think that it could be 10. I think it could be 10, and I think it could be even faster, but it wouldn't be at the sacrifice of scientific methodology.
I got to cut you off because we got about 45 seconds left on the show, and I want or 90 seconds left on the show, and I want to let you talk a little bit about how people can reach you or your organization.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much. Just go to the MAPS website, www.MAPS, like Maps of the World, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, maps.org. You could send an email to Ask MAPS. We have somebody who answers that all the time.
Great.
And you can donate. We have a lot of stuff for free. We have when Albert Hoffman, before he died, Sandoz, the company he worked for, was bought up by Novartis, the world's largest pharmaceutical company, and he gave all of his LSD papers and psilocybin papers, which he'd collected, to us and Arrowwood and DanceSafe, and they're all digitized for free on the website. There's just enormous information. Our whole conference, we had the biggest conference in 40 years in April, and we've videotaped and audio taped the entire conference.
30 seconds.
In the United States, and we're putting up all of the videotapes from the entire conference on our website. So, and we need your support. We can't do it without individuals and together, it's amazing what we can do.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We had Rick Doblin, Ph.D. from maps.org. And say goodbye to everyone, Rick.
Yeah, goodbye, everybody. Well, not goodbye. We'll stay around and do a bunch of stuff together over the years. And thank you, too, for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Are you still on?
Rick?
No, he's off.